On the morning of my daughter's 6th birthday, at exactly 8:17 a.m., my husband wheeled me to the front porch, set the brake on my chair, and walked back inside without saying a word. 7 minutes later, he came out holding a manila envelope worth more than our entire marriage. I didn't open it right away because I already knew what was inside. And if you've ever felt your life end quietly, not with shouting, not with tears, but with paperwork, then you already understand why my hands didn't move for a full 30 seconds. Before I tell you what happened next, do me a favor. Like this video so it reaches someone who might need to hear it tonight. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if the person who promised to protect you became the one who erased you? My name is Hannah Caldwell. I was 29 years old that morning, and I had not stood on my own feet for 413 days. The accident happened on a rainy Tuesday in Portland, Oregon. I was driving home from my night shift at the veterinary clinic where I worked as a surgical tech. Not glamorous, not high-paying, but steady. I loved animals because they never lied. They never pretended loyalty while planning escape routes. The police report said the other driver ran a red light at 42 miles per hour. The surgeon later told me my spine absorbed the impact like a fragile bridge collapsing under sudden weight. T12 burst fracture, complete. Permanent paralysis from the waist down. I remember the exact moment I understood. It wasn't in the operating room. It wasn't when the doctor explained. It was 3 days later, when a nurse accidentally dropped a cold metal tray onto my legs, and I felt nothing. Not pain, not pressure, nothing at all. That was the moment my life split into two versions. Before, silence. And after. My husband, Daniel Caldwell, cried when he first saw me in the ICU. Real tears, the kind that leave salt lines on a man's face. He held my hand and said the words everyone says, "We'll get through this, together." At the time, I believed him, because Daniel had always been the stable one. A financial analyst, precise, controlled, practical. The kind of man who read mortgage contracts for fun and corrected restaurant bills down to the penny. He liked things predictable. And paralysis is the most unpredictable thing that can happen inside a human body. The first 3 months after the accident, he was perfect. He installed ramps in the house. He scheduled my physical therapy. He learned how to transfer me from bed to chair without hurting my shoulders. He even braided our daughter Lily's hair every morning, though his fingers fumbled clumsily. People told me I was lucky. They said most husbands would leave. I remember thinking how cruel that sounded, because Daniel hadn't left. Not yet. The change didn't happen suddenly. It happened in small withdrawals, like watching money disappear from a bank account, one quiet transaction at a time. First, he stopped sitting with me during therapy sessions. Then, he started working later hours. Then he stopped touching me unless necessary for practical reasons, lifting, positioning, adjusting. 6 months after the accident, he moved into the guest bedroom. He said it was because he needed uninterrupted sleep for work. I told myself that was reasonable. Because when you lose control of your body, you start accepting explanations just to avoid losing control of your mind. But the real shift happened when insurance payments began to run out. My long-term disability covered only 60% of my salary. Medical bills stacked quickly. Adaptive equipment, home modifications, ongoing rehab. Numbers started ruling Daniel's behavior. I saw it in the way his jaw tightened whenever another invoice arrived. I saw it in the spreadsheets he began leaving open on the kitchen laptop. Columns labeled: projected lifetime care cost, loss of earning potential, child care risk factors. I once asked him why he was calculating things like that. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he said something I will never forget. You can't survive a disaster without understanding the total damage. At the time, I thought he meant financially. I didn't realize he meant emotionally specifically, the damage to his own life. About 9 months after the accident, he started taking Lily out alone on weekends. Father-daughter outings, he called them. Zoo trips, movies, playgrounds. I encouraged it at first, because guilt eats you alive when you become a parent who can't run, can't chase, can't kneel to tie shoes. But one night, Lily said something that made my stomach drop. She asked me quietly while brushing her teeth, "Mommy, why does Daddy say it's easier when it's just us?" I remember the exact way the bathroom light flickered when she said that. Like the universe itself hesitated. I asked her what she meant. She shrugged and said, "He says it's less complicated when he doesn't have to worry about the chair." The chair, not me. The chair. That was the first time I understood that in Daniel's mind, I had already become an object, something heavy, inconvenient, immovable, a logistical problem, not a partner. And problems, in Daniel's world, were always solved. That brings us back to the morning of Lily's birthday. The envelope sat on my lap, heavier than it should have been. When I finally opened it, the first line read, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." The second page hit harder. "Request for sole legal and physical custody of minor child." He wasn't just leaving me. He was trying to legally erase me from my daughter's daily life. The reason listed under parental fitness concerns made my vision blur. Mother's permanent disability significantly limits her ability to provide independent care and a safe environment. I read that sentence 3 times. Each time, slower. Each time, colder. Because here's the truth nobody tells you about betrayal. It doesn't feel like being stabbed. It feels like being quietly replaced. I looked up at the front door. Still closed. Daniel hadn't come back outside. He didn't even want to watch me read it. And that was when I noticed something strange, printed at the bottom of the filing date. It wasn't yesterday. It wasn't last week. It was time-stamped. File 63 days earlier, which meant something else had been happening behind my back for over 2 months. Something planned. Something deliberate. Something that explained why he'd suddenly started taking Lily out alone so often. But the most chilling realization wasn't the timing. It was the name of the attorney representing him, because it was someone I knew, someone who had once sat at our dinner table. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't just a divorce. It was a strategy. On the first Saturday of October, exactly 63 days before I received the envelope, Daniel told me he had to leave early for a client breakfast that started at 7 a.m. He left the house at 6:12, wearing his navy suit, carrying his leather portfolio, and taking Lily with him, even though she still had cereal milk on her chin. At the time, I didn't question it, because when you depend on someone to help you out of bed, you stop questioning their schedule. You start adjusting your reality around theirs. But now, sitting on the porch with that envelope in my lap, I realized something else. There had never been a client breakfast that morning. Because the attorney listed on the petition was Rebecca Whitmore. Full name, Rebecca Elaine Whitmore. Family law specialist. Billing rate, $480 per hour. And more importantly, Daniel's college friend who had attended our wedding 9 years earlier. I remembered her perfectly. Tall, blonde, calm in a way that felt calculated, not natural. She was the kind of woman who listened more than she spoke, then delivered opinions that sounded like legal verdicts instead of casual advice. At our wedding reception, she had once told me something that stuck in my mind for years. Marriage is just a contract with emotional clauses. I laughed at the time because I thought she was joking. Now, staring at her name printed under representing party, I realized she had probably meant every word. And that's when the first open loop began tightening in my chest. Because hiring Rebecca Whitmore wasn't a last-minute decision. It meant Daniel had been planning this for months. Carefully, quietly, like an accountant balancing books before closing a company. I wheeled myself back into the house, hands shaking slightly as I rolled across the hardwood floor he had insisted we install because it was wheelchair-friendly. I noticed something strange immediately. The hallway closet door was open. Inside, 3 of Daniel's winter coats were missing. Not all of them, just the expensive ones. The ones he wore to business meetings. That's when a quiet realization settled into my stomach. He hadn't just filed for divorce. He had already started leaving. I rolled toward the kitchen. On the counter sat Lily's pink birthday cupcakes, 6 of them, 1 for each year. Daniel had baked them himself the night before. Perfect frosting swirls, neatly spaced rainbow sprinkles. They looked like evidence in a crime scene where the criminal still cared about appearances. Because that was Daniel's way. He never created chaos. He created order while dismantling your life. I checked my phone. No messages, no calls, no apology. Just a calendar notification reminding me of Lily's school pickup time at 3:10 p.m. Except there was something else on the calendar that made my breath stop. A recurring note Daniel had created months ago. Saturday, Lily and Dad Day, every single Saturday. For the past 11 weeks, that's when I understood something colder than betrayal. This wasn't an impulsive decision. It was a transition plan. He had been slowly conditioning Lily to life without me, week by week, outing by outing, memory by memory. And suddenly, something Lily had said weeks earlier came rushing back. She had once told me quietly, while drawing at the dining table, "Daddy says we might live in a place with a yard soon." I had assumed she meant someday. Now I realized she meant soon in a literal sense. Because Daniel wasn't just leaving emotionally. He was preparing to physically relocate our daughter. Without me. I looked again at the custody request section. It included a detailed parenting proposal. I forced myself to read every line. Proposed living arrangement. Lily residing full-time with father. Mother visitation. Supervised. Twice monthly. 2-hour sessions at a family access center. 2 hours. Twice a month. 6 years of motherhood, reduced to 48 hours per year. The number was so precise, it felt surgical. That's when I want to ask you something. Be honest, if someone tried to mathematically shrink your role in your child's life like that, would you fight immediately? Or would you freeze first, like I did? Because freezing is what happened to me. Not crying, not screaming, just a deep, cold stillness. Like your mind temporarily shuts down to protect itself from understanding. Then I reached the section titled, Supporting Evidence. Attached were 3 statements from character witnesses. The first was from Daniel's coworker, the second from our neighbor across the street. But the third one made my vision blur again, because it was signed by Margaret Caldwell, Daniel's mother. And the sentence she wrote felt like a knife sharpened by years of quiet judgment. While Hannah loves Lily, her condition makes her emotionally unstable and physically incapable of providing a safe home. Emotionally unstable. That phrase echoed in my head, because in the 413 days since the accident, I had never once screamed, thrown anything, or lost control in front of Lily. I had forced myself to stay calm through pain, humiliation, dependency, and fear. I had done everything right, and it still wasn't enough. That was when the second layer of betrayal began to surface in my mind. Because Daniel couldn't have gathered those statements overnight. It meant he had been quietly building a case against me, documenting, collecting, positioning, like a lawyer preparing for trial, which raised a question that felt heavier than anything else. What exactly had he been telling people about me during those months? I looked toward the living room wall. Our family photo still hung there, taken 2 years before the accident. Daniel smiling, me standing beside him, Lily sitting on his shoulders. Back then, he used to say something whenever we looked at that photo. "This is my entire world." Now I realized something terrifying. He hadn't lied. He had simply redefined what his world looked like. And I was no longer part of it. I sat there for a long time, staring at the envelope in my lap, until another detail caught my eye. Something small, printed near the back. A scheduled court hearing date, November 18th, just 41 days away, which meant something else. Daniel wasn't just planning to leave. He was planning to finalize custody quickly, before I had time to recover, before I had time to fight, before I had time to gather evidence. And that's when I noticed something else written in the legal notes section, a line that made my heart stop completely. Temporary custody arrangement, already in informal practice. Informal practice. It sounded harmless, but it meant something very specific in family court terms. It meant Daniel had already been documenting a pattern, showing the court that Lily spent more time with him than with me. And suddenly, every Saturday outing, every school pickup he insisted on handling, every moment he subtly positioned himself as the primary caregiver. All of it made perfect sense. This hadn't started 63 days ago. It had started nearly a year earlier. And the worst realization of all came quietly, like a final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Daniel hadn't waited until I became strong enough to fight back. He had waited until I was weak enough not to. But there was still one detail in that paperwork I didn't understand. A financial document attached at the end. A property disclosure, listing an asset I had never seen before. An account opened under Daniel's name alone, created exactly 11 months earlier, with a balance of $184,000. Money that had never existed in our joint finances. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't just about custody. It was about something much bigger. Something Daniel had been building in secret long before he handed me that envelope. 3 weeks before the accident anniversary, on a Tuesday at exactly 2:36 p.m., I found a bank notification buried deep inside an email folder Daniel thought I never checked. It showed a transfer of $12,500 into an account I had never seen before. The subject line read, "Automated monthly contribution." At the time, I assumed it was related to his retirement savings or some investment portfolio he managed privately, because Daniel handled all our finances, down to the smallest subscription. I trusted him completely back then. But now, staring at the property disclosure in his divorce paperwork, I realized that transfer wasn't an investment. It was part of something else. Something he had been building steadily for almost a year. The account listed in the legal documents was under his name only. Opened 11 months ago. Balance, $184,000. The numbers lined up too perfectly. 11 months of monthly transfers, averaging around $12,000 to $17,000. That wasn't accidental savings. That was deliberate extraction from our life, from our future, from the resources that were supposed to pay for my medical care and Lily's stability. I rolled to the kitchen table, pulled my laptop toward me, and logged into our old shared budgeting software. It took me nearly 15 minutes because my hands were shaking, not with panic, but with the cold focus that comes when something inside you finally stops hoping. I opened transaction history for the past year. At first glance, everything looked normal. Mortgage payments, utilities, groceries, medical bills. But Daniel had always been meticulous. And meticulous people don't leave obvious trails. They hide things in plain sight. That's when I noticed a pattern. Every month, around the same date, there were transfers labeled Consulting Expense Adjustment. Amounts varied slightly each time. $9,800, $13,200, $15,600. They appeared legitimate because Daniel occasionally did freelance financial consulting on the side. But one detail made my stomach drop. The recipient account number matched the one listed in the divorce paperwork, which meant he wasn't earning extra income. He was redirecting marital funds, slowly, quietly, for nearly a year. That realization landed like ice in my veins, because it meant something even worse. He hadn't just planned to leave. He had been preparing financially to win. And family courts care deeply about financial stability when deciding custody. Daniel wasn't just trying to take Lily. He was constructing a narrative. Stable father with strong financial resources. Disabled mother, dependent on support. It was strategy disguised as practicality. I sat there staring at the screen until another memory surfaced. One that suddenly felt completely different in hindsight. About 8 months ago, Daniel had insisted we meet with a financial planner. He said it was to future-proof Lily's education fund. I had agreed, without question, because trusting him had always felt natural. During that meeting, the planner asked a question that now echoed loudly in my mind. What contingency plans do you have in case one parent becomes unable to provide care long-term? At the time, Daniel answered calmly, "We need to prioritize Lily's security above everything else." I thought he meant emotionally. Now I realized he meant legally. That meeting hadn't been about college savings. It had been about documentation, building a case, establishing a narrative of responsible foresight. And I hadn't seen any of it happening. That's when a heavier realization settled in. Daniel hadn't changed after the accident. He had revealed who he truly was under pressure. Someone who approached relationships like risk management. Someone who calculated outcomes instead of processing emotions. Someone who didn't abandon people impulsively. He phased them out methodically. I closed the laptop and rolled toward the living room window. Across the street, Mrs. Carver, the neighbor, who had submitted a witness statement against me, was watering her plants. She waved when she saw me, smiling. Friendly, like nothing had changed. Like she hadn't written a sworn statement describing me as an unsafe mother. And that's when something clicked into place inside my mind. Because Mrs. Carver had often helped watch Lily during the first months after my accident, she had seen me struggle with transfers, with fatigue, with adapting to my new limitations. But she had also seen something else. She had seen Daniel step in, take over tasks, position himself as the more capable caregiver. At the time, I thought he was being supportive. Now I realized something darker. He had been performing, not for me. For witnesses. That's when I want to ask you something directly. If someone helped you every day while secretly documenting your weakest moments, would you even recognize it as betrayal? Or would you mistake it for love until it was too late? Because that's exactly what Daniel had done. He didn't yell. He didn't insult. He didn't withdraw affection dramatically. He simply built a reality where he appeared indispensable and where I gradually looked less capable by comparison. The brilliance of his strategy made it even more chilling because courts don't respond to emotional truths. They respond to documented patterns. And Daniel had spent nearly a year creating one. But as I sat there absorbing all of this, one question kept circling in my mind. Why had he waited until Lily's birthday to serve me the papers? That timing felt deliberate, cruel, symbolic. Daniel wasn't the type to act emotionally, which meant there had to be a strategic reason for that specific day. I looked again at the court hearing date, November 18th. Then I looked at Lily's school calendar pinned on the fridge. Parent-teacher conferences scheduled the same week. School record submission deadlines shortly after. And suddenly, the pattern became clear. If Daniel secured temporary custody before those dates, all official school documentation would list him as primary guardian, which would strengthen his legal position even further. This wasn't just a divorce timeline. It was a procedural strategy. Everything aligned. Everything calculated. Everything designed to make my role shrink quietly until it disappeared on paper. I sat there for a long time, feeling something unfamiliar growing inside me. Not panic, not despair, something colder, something steady. Because here's the truth Daniel had never understood about me. Before I became a veterinary surgical tech, before I became a wife, before I became a mother, I grew up watching my own mother fight a custody battle that lasted 7 years. I knew exactly how family courts worked. I knew how evidence mattered more than emotion. And I knew one critical rule that Daniel had overlooked. The person who controls the narrative first doesn't always win. The person who reveals the hidden truth at the right moment does. But there was still one piece missing. One question I couldn't answer yet. The $184,000 account was real. The custody strategy was clear. The witness statements were damaging. But there was something else in the paperwork that didn't fit. A sealed attachment listed as Exhibit D, Medical Assessment Report. It was marked confidential, and I had never seen it before, which meant Daniel had submitted a medical document about me without my knowledge, without my consent. And that was when a quiet, terrifying possibility entered my mind. Because if that report said what I feared it might say, it could legally prove something far worse than financial instability. It could prove that Daniel wasn't just trying to limit my custody. He was trying to declare me permanently unfit as a parent. 4 days after Lily's birthday, at exactly 9:40 a.m., a process server knocked on my door while I was in the middle of transferring from my chair to the couch. He waited 12 full seconds before knocking again. Not aggressively, just professionally, like this was routine. Because for him, it was. For me, it was the sound of escalation. Daniel had already served me once with the initial petition. This second envelope meant something else. An amendment. Or worse, a temporary motion. I wheeled myself to the door, smoothed my shirt, and opened it. The man avoided eye contact when he handed me the documents. Temporary custody hearing moved forward, he said flatly. New date, October 28th. That was 21 days away. He left before I could respond. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I simply rolled back to the kitchen table and opened the envelope with steady hands. Inside was a motion for temporary orders. Daniel was requesting immediate temporary sole custody, pending final judgment. He cited new medical evidence suggesting I was unable to provide unsupervised care due to cognitive and emotional instability following traumatic injury. Cognitive instability. The words looked almost clinical, but they carried lethal weight in family court. That's when I turned to Exhibit D, the sealed medical assessment. I broke the seal slowly, because some truths don't explode. They dissolve you gradually. The report was from a neuropsychologist, Dr. Alan Brewer. Evaluation date, 2 months earlier. 2 months, which meant Daniel had scheduled it quietly. The assessment summary read, patient demonstrates signs of depressive withdrawal, emotional suppression, and potential executive functioning delays under stress. I read it again. Executive functioning delays. Under stress. The irony was suffocating. Of course I was under stress. I was paralyzed. Financially dependent. Physically limited. Trying to protect my daughter. But the report didn't say I was incapable of parenting. It said something far more strategic. That under stress, my cognitive processing slowed. In other words, I appeared less decisive, less responsive, less stable. And suddenly, everything made sense. Daniel hadn't sent me to that evaluation out of concern. He had framed it as part of my rehabilitation plan. Insurance requires updated neuroscreening, he had told me casually. I remembered sitting in that sterile office, answering memory tests, pattern recognition exercises, mood questionnaires. I remembered feeling tired, foggy, because I hadn't slept well the night before, because Lily had woken up from a nightmare, because my back spasms had kept me awake. And now that normal human exhaustion was being reframed as cognitive weakness, that was tier 2, the documentation layer, the strategic evidence. And it was brilliant in its cruelty, because Daniel hadn't fabricated anything. He had simply captured me at my most vulnerable, then preserved it as proof. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. There's something uniquely terrifying about reading an official document that describes you inaccurately, but not falsely enough to easily disprove. He hadn't accused me of abuse. He hadn't claimed I was violent. He had chosen something subtler. Incapacity. The kind that sounds compassionate on the surface, but devastating in court. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was Margaret Caldwell, Daniel's mother. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice was soft, measured, performing concern. Hannah, sweetheart, we're just worried about Lily. You've been through so much. There it was. Not accusation. Concern. Weaponized empathy. I'm still her mother, I said calmly. A pause. Then she delivered the line I think she'd rehearsed. Sometimes loving someone means knowing when you can't give them what they need. That sentence hung in the air like smoke. And that's when something inside me shifted permanently. Because I realized something critical. They had already decided what I was. Fragile, dependent, replaceable. And once people decide that about you, they stop looking for evidence to the contrary. They start filtering everything through that belief. That night, Daniel came home late, later than usual. He didn't mention the new hearing date. He didn't ask if I'd received the motion. He acted normal. Too normal. He made pasta, helped Lily with homework, checked emails. At 9:15 p.m., he knocked on my bedroom door. He didn't come in, just stood there. I don't want this to get ugly, he said quietly. I almost laughed. Ugly. As if serving your disabled wife accelerated custody motions and submitting neuropsych reports wasn't already war. You already made it ugly, I replied. He exhaled slowly. You know this is about stability. There it was again. That word, stability. He said it like a financial term, like volatility was something to eliminate. You think I'm unstable? I asked. He hesitated. Not because he didn't have an answer, because he was choosing the safest phrasing. I think Lily deserves the strongest version of us. The strongest version. Not the truest. Not the most loving. The strongest. And in his equation, strength meant mobility, income, efficiency. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply said, if you cooperate, we can make this easier. Cooperate. Another word that sounded harmless, but meant surrender. That's when I looked directly at him and said something that surprised even me. You didn't marry a liability. You married a woman. His jaw tightened, just slightly. And in that flicker, I saw it. Not guilt, not doubt, just calculation. He left without another word, and I sat there in the quiet, replaying every interaction from the past year, every time he stepped in before I could try something myself, every time he gently suggested, let me handle it, every time he positioned himself as the competent one. He hadn't been rescuing me, he had been replacing me, gradually, strategically, so that when this moment came, everyone would already believe he was the better choice. The next morning, I called 3 family law attorneys in Portland. The first 2 declined after brief consultations. Too complicated, too uphill. Then I spoke to the third. Her name was Vanessa Ortiz, 38 years old, former public defender, now specializing in high-conflict custody cases. She listened quietly as I explained everything. The accident, the account, The neuro report, the accelerated hearing. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then she asked one question. Has he underestimated you yet? I blinked. I don't know. She said something then that felt like the first solid ground I'd touched in months. Men who build silent cases often assume the other side won't recognize the structure until it's finished. Another pause. If he moved the hearing up, it means he thinks you're not ready. Not ready. That word sparked something sharp inside me, because Daniel was right about one thing. I hadn't been ready before, but he had just made a mistake. He had accelerated the timeline, which meant he was nervous about something, and I needed to figure out what that was before October 28th, because if I didn't, the court wouldn't just limit my custody. It would redefine me permanently. And there was still one question neither Daniel nor his attorney had addressed. Why had he started diverting $12,000 a month 11 months ago, 3 months before the accident even happened? 11 months before the accident, on a cold Thursday morning in January, at exactly 7:05 a.m., Daniel insisted we open a joint calendar and map out our 5-year family plan. He printed 3 copies. Each copy had 60 months broken into neat columns, color-coded savings goals, career milestones, projected childcare costs. At the time, I thought it was sweet, his analytical way of dreaming about the future. Now, sitting at my kitchen table nearly 2 years later, I realized that document wasn't a plan. It was a blueprint for separation. Because when I pulled that old binder from the cabinet and flipped to January, I saw something that made my hands go completely still. A handwritten note in Daniel's precise block letters. Begin asset protection phase. Dated the exact week he opened the hidden account. 3 months before my accident. Before paralysis. Before everything fell apart. That detail changed everything because it meant something terrifying. Daniel hadn't started preparing after I became disabled. He had started preparing while our life still looked normal, which raised a question so heavy it almost felt dangerous to think it. Was the accident really the beginning of his plan, or just an opportunity he exploited when it happened? I stared at that note for a long time, feeling the slow burn of a realization that was colder than rage. Because this wasn't reactive behavior anymore. It was premeditated restructuring of his life. I flipped further through the binder. More notes. More coded language. Contingency housing research. Independent credit expansion. Custodial documentation. Every phrase sounded clinical. Like he wasn't planning a divorce, he was planning an exit strategy from a business partnership. Then I reached a page labeled Risk Factors. There were only 2 items listed. Item 1, job instability in veterinary field. Item 2, Hannah's high emotional dependence on family structure. I felt something inside my chest tighten. High emotional dependence. That's how he categorized my love for our life, our marriage, our child. Not commitment, not loyalty. Dependence, which meant, in his mind, I wasn't a partner. I was a liability. And that realization unlocked another memory I had ignored at the time. About 1.5 years ago, Daniel had suddenly insisted we change our life insurance policies. He framed it as a responsible update. He increased his own coverage significantly, but reduced mine, saying it wasn't necessary, since I had stopped working full-time after Lily was born. At the time, I trusted him. Now, seeing this binder, I understood. He had been reducing his financial ties to me long before anything went wrong, quietly minimizing risk, positioning himself for independence. And the accident had simply accelerated the timeline. That's when I want to ask you something directly. If you discovered someone you loved had been planning a life without you before any crisis even happened, would that hurt more than betrayal after the fact? Or would it feel like your entire relationship had been a delayed goodbye? Because that's what it felt like to me. Like I had been living inside a future he had already decided to leave. I closed the binder and rolled back from the table, my hands cold despite the heater running. Then I noticed something else. A sticky note, tucked into the back cover. One simple line, written in blue ink. Consult Rebecca before Phase 3. Phase 3. That meant there were stages. And Rebecca Whitmore hadn't just been hired during the divorce. She had been involved much earlier, which explained something that had always felt slightly strange in hindsight. 2 summers ago, Rebecca had visited us for dinner. She wasn't in Portland on business. She lived in Seattle. She claimed she was just passing through. But now I remembered that evening clearly. Because Daniel and Rebecca had spent nearly an hour alone in the backyard while I put Lily to bed. When I asked later what they talked about, Daniel had shrugged casually, just catching up. But that wasn't true, because when Rebecca came back inside, she had looked at me with an expression I couldn't understand at the time. It wasn't hostility, it wasn't pity, it was assessment. Like a lawyer quietly evaluating a case. That memory hit me like ice water now, because it meant something critical. Rebecca hadn't just been Daniel's attorney. She had been part of his planning phase long before any legal filings, which meant the custody battle I was facing wasn't just well prepared. It was years in the making. And that realization shifted something inside me completely. Because until that moment, part of me still believed this had started after the accident. Now I knew the truth. Daniel hadn't changed because of my disability. He had revealed a long-hidden plan when the circumstances made it easier. The next piece fell into place that same afternoon when Vanessa Ortiz called me back. Her voice was calm, but sharper than before. "I pulled preliminary financial records," she said. There was a brief pause. Then she added quietly, "That account he opened 11 months ago wasn't his first separate asset." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" She inhaled slowly before answering. 3 years ago, he established a private LLC. 3 years. That was when Lily was 3 years old, when our life still looked stable. "What kind of LLC?" I asked. "Asset holding company," Vanessa said. Another pause. "It's a legal structure people often use to shield funds during divorce." Shield. The word landed heavily. "Why would he create that years before any divorce?" I whispered. Vanessa didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet certainty. "Because people don't build escape hatches overnight." I closed my eyes. And suddenly, every small financial decision from the past few years rearranged itself into a pattern. Daniel taking over all bill payments. Daniel discouraging me from keeping separate credit cards. Daniel insisting on efficiency in managing joint assets. He hadn't been controlling. He had been consolidating, preparing. And that's when Vanessa said something that changed the direction of my thoughts entirely. "There's one more detail," she said. "The LLC isn't empty." My heart began to pound slowly. "How much is in it?" Her answer came quietly. "Approximately $312,000 in liquid assets." $312,000. Money I had never known existed. Money that could easily support a new home. A custody case. A fresh start. Without me. But the most chilling part wasn't the amount. It was the timing. Because Vanessa added one final detail that made the entire room feel colder. The first deposit into that LLC was made exactly 2 days after your wedding anniversary. 2 days after an anniversary where Daniel had toasted to forever, which meant something even more devastating than financial betrayal. He had been planning his independence while celebrating our permanence. And suddenly, a question rose in my mind that refused to go away. If Daniel had been preparing to leave for years, then why hadn't he done it earlier? Why wait until after my accident? What changed that made him finally activate Phase 3? Because the answer to that question would reveal something far more dangerous than divorce strategy. It would reveal his real motive. 10 days before the temporary custody hearing, at exactly 4:52 p.m., I received an email from Lily's elementary school requesting confirmation of primary guardian status for updated emergency records. The form had already been partially completed. Under primary guardian, Daniel's name was filled in. Under secondary contact, mine. Secondary. The word sat there quietly. Official. Clinical. Reducing 6 years of motherhood to a backup contact in case the main system failed. That was when the escalation stopped feeling theoretical. It was happening in real time. Procedurally. Document by document. I stared at the timestamp on the school form. It had been submitted by Daniel 2 days earlier, which meant he was already acting as if temporary custody had been granted. Vanessa had warned me about this tactic. Judges often preserve existing patterns, she'd said. If he creates the appearance of primary caregiving now, the court may formalize it later. Appearance. That word echoed louder than anything else. Because Daniel's strength had never been emotion. It was optics. I called the school immediately. My voice was steady. I asked to speak with the administrative coordinator. Her name was Paula Henderson. I explained calmly that no court order had been issued, that custody was still joint, that any unilateral change was premature. There was a pause on the line. Then Paula said something that made my stomach tighten. Mr. Caldwell informed us you were considering long-term residential rehabilitation. Residential rehabilitation. I gripped the phone harder. I have never said that. Another pause. Well, he indicated your medical team recommended additional inpatient support. There it was. Tier 2 expanding. Not just documents. Narrative. He wasn't accusing me outright. He was planting suggestions. That I might need extended care. That I might not be fully available. That Lily might need stability elsewhere. And the terrifying part was how reasonable it sounded to outsiders. Because I was in a wheelchair. Because I had medical appointments. Because fatigue sometimes slowed me down. Daniel was weaponizing context. That night, after Lily went to bed, I confronted him in the kitchen. Not emotionally. Not loudly. Just directly. You told the school I'm entering residential rehab. He didn't look surprised. He didn't even deny it. I said it was a possibility, he replied evenly. It's not. He leaned against the counter, arms folded. They asked about emergency reliability. I gave them a practical answer. Practical. That word again. You're manufacturing instability, I said quietly. He shook his head. I'm anticipating it. There was no anger in his voice, no guilt. Just logic, which made it worse. Because you can argue with rage. You can argue with cruelty. You can't argue with someone who frames betrayal as preparation. Why now? I asked finally. It was the question that had been sitting inside me since I found the binder. Why activate Phase 3 after the accident? Why not years ago? He looked at me carefully, and for a split second, I saw something flicker behind his calm expression. Not remorse. Not hesitation. Fear. But not fear of losing me. Fear of losing control. You changed, he said. I felt my jaw tighten. How? He exhaled slowly. You stopped depending on me emotionally. That answer stunned me. Because it wasn't about my paralysis. It wasn't about finances. It wasn't about caregiving strain. It was about control. After the accident, something in me had hardened. Not outwardly, but internally. I had stopped asking for reassurance, stopped seeking validation, stopped reacting to his subtle withdrawals. I became quieter, more observant, more independent emotionally, even if not physically. And Daniel had noticed. He continued speaking, his tone still composed. You don't need me the way you used to. There it was, the real motive, not escape from burden, escape from irrelevance. My accident hadn't weakened our marriage in his mind. It had changed the power dynamic. Before, I leaned on him emotionally. After, I adapted inwardly. And that shift made him unnecessary. For a man who structured life around control, that was unacceptable. I'm not your dependent, I said softly. I'm your wife. He didn't respond, because he knew the truth. This wasn't about disability. It was about dominance. And when he realized he couldn't dominate emotionally anymore, he chose legal superiority instead. But there was still something missing. Because financial shielding, custody acceleration, school narrative manipulation, all of it required urgency. Why move the hearing forward? Why escalate now? The answer arrived unexpectedly the next morning, when Vanessa called again. Her voice was different this time, sharper. He's selling the house, she said. My breath stalled. What? There's a pre-listing agreement filed under his LLC, she continued. The property is being prepared for market under a transfer structure. Transfer structure. That meant something specific. Daniel wasn't listing the house under our joint ownership. He was moving it through his LLC first, which meant if temporary custody was granted quickly, he could argue that relocation was necessary for Lily's stability. He wasn't just preparing to leave. He was preparing to move Lily out of Portland. Out of state, possibly, before I could legally stop it. That was the urgency. That was Phase 3. And suddenly, the timeline made horrifying sense. Accelerate temporary custody. Establish primary guardian status. Transfer property into shielded asset structure. Relocate. Finalize. By the time I reacted, it would be irreversible. I sat in silence for a long moment. Then Vanessa said something quietly. There's one weakness in his plan. I waited. He's assuming you won't counterattack publicly. Publicly. The word hung in the air. Because custody hearings are private. Divorce proceedings are sealed, but property transfers, LLC filings, those leave public records. And Daniel's entire strategy depended on discretion, on quiet paperwork, on narratives whispered into institutional ears. If exposed in the right forum, at the right moment, his image of calculated stability could fracture. That's when something inside me settled into place. Not anger, not revenge. Clarity. Because Daniel had underestimated one thing. He thought paralysis meant powerlessness. He thought emotional quiet meant surrender. He thought documentation was a one-sided weapon. But he forgot something critical. I grew up watching a custody war. I learned the rules early. And the most important rule of all is this: the person who controls the reveal controls the outcome. I looked at the calendar. October 28th, temporary hearing. 8 days away. Daniel believed I was still scrambling, still overwhelmed, still fragile. He had no idea I was already building my own file. And he had absolutely no idea what I had just discovered buried inside his LLC registration paperwork. Because tucked between formation documents and asset transfers was a secondary signatory name, a name that didn't belong to a business partner and didn't belong to his mother. It belonged to someone far more dangerous, someone who would destroy his entire narrative if brought into the light. 3 nights before the temporary custody hearing, at exactly 1:13 a.m., I woke up to the sound of Daniel speaking quietly on the back patio. He thought I was asleep. He thought the sliding glass door muted his voice completely. But late-night silence carries sound in strange ways. And I caught one sentence clearly through the faint crack in the door seal. "No, she doesn't know your name is on it. Your name on it." The words slid into place instantly with the document I had discovered earlier that day, the LLC registration listing a secondary signatory. I didn't move. I didn't breathe loudly. I simply listened. Because sometimes the most powerful action is absolute stillness. Daniel continued speaking in low, measured tones. "Yes, after the hearing. We can finalize once custody is secured." Another pause. Then something that made my stomach turn cold. "She won't fight publicly. She never does." That sentence told me everything. Not just about his plan, about how he saw me. Predictable, contained, safe to outmaneuver. And in that moment, something inside me shifted into what I can only describe as dangerous quiet. The kind that doesn't react, doesn't lash out, just observes and waits. I wheeled silently toward the hallway, giving him the illusion of privacy, because I needed him to keep underestimating me. The next morning, I reviewed the LLC documents again with Vanessa. The secondary signatory name was Lily Ann Caldwell, my 6-year-old daughter. My hands had trembled when I first saw it, because minors cannot legally sign business documents, which meant something very specific. Daniel hadn't added her as a partner. He had designated her as a future beneficiary asset holder. In legal terms, it was a custodial trust arrangement disguised within the LLC structure. Vanessa explained calmly, "He's positioning all major assets under a child-focused financial shield." I stared at the paperwork. "That sounds responsible." She nodded slowly. "It can be. But in custody litigation, it also creates a powerful narrative." She paused before finishing the thought. "It suggests the father is safeguarding the child's future, while the mother is financially dependent." There it was again. Narrative. Daniel wasn't just planning a divorce. He was crafting a story for the court. A stable provider father, securing his daughter's long-term security. A disabled mother, unable to contribute equally. And here was the most chilling part. Legally, it wasn't unethical. It was strategic. He hadn't hidden money illegally. He hadn't falsified records. He had simply arranged assets in a way that strengthened his custody case, which meant attacking the finances directly wouldn't work, because he had built everything within legal boundaries. But what Daniel didn't understand was something deeper. Narratives aren't only built with paperwork. They're built with truth. And truth has layers that strategy often overlooks. That afternoon, Lily sat beside me on the living room floor, coloring quietly. She was drawing our house, but something about the picture made my throat tighten. She had drawn 2 separate buildings, one with a ramp, one without. She pointed to the second one. "That's Daddy's new house," she said casually. My heart skipped. "New house?" She nodded. He showed me pictures. It has stairs and a swing set. Stairs, which meant one thing: not wheelchair accessible. which meant Daniel had already selected a home designed for a life without me. He hadn't even considered shared parenting logistics. He had planned total separation. I swallowed carefully before asking another question. When did he show you that? She thought for a moment. Last Saturday. He said we might move soon. Soon. That word confirmed everything Vanessa suspected. Daniel wasn't waiting for final judgment. He was preparing relocation immediately after temporary custody approval, which meant the hearing wasn't just about custody. It was about geography. Once Lily left Portland, legal battles would become exponentially harder, and Daniel knew that. I sat there quietly while Lily colored, my mind moving faster than it had in months. Not with panic, with calculation, because I had finally reached the stage the emotional timeline calls dangerous calm. The moment when fear burns out and clarity takes over. That evening, Daniel returned home carrying groceries. He acted normal. Again, because that was his strength. Control through routine. He placed a bag of Lily's favorite snacks on the counter and glanced at me briefly. "You should rest more," he said casually. "You look tired." That sentence carried a hidden meaning now. Not concern. Documentation. Every comment he made could later be framed as evidence of my fatigue. Every observation became part of his case narrative. I looked at him steadily and said something that surprised even him. "You've been planning this for years." He froze, only for half a second. But it was enough, because people who live by control reveal themselves in micro moments when their script breaks. "I've been planning for stability," he corrected calmly, "not abandonment." That was his language. Always reframed, always neutral, always justified. Then I said the sentence that made his jaw tighten for real this time. "You chose a house without ramps." Silence fell instantly. He didn't deny it. He didn't explain, because there was no strategic way to spin that fact. Instead, he said something cold and simple. "Lily deserves a normal environment." Normal. That word landed heavier than any accusation. Because in his mind, normal meant walking, running, climbing stairs, a life without adaptation, without inconvenience, without me. I held his gaze and spoke quietly. "Normal doesn't mean abandoning people." He didn't answer. He turned away, because that was the first moment our conversation had stepped outside his controlled narrative. And control is everything to someone like Daniel. He left the room without another word. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because of fear, because of preparation. I reviewed every document again, every timeline detail, every procedural step. And I realized something critical. Daniel's entire strategy depended on private proceedings, closed hearings, sealed records, institutional decisions made quietly. He believed discretion protected him. But he had forgotten one thing. The upcoming hearing wasn't the only event scheduled for October 28th. That same day, at 2 p.m., 3 hours after our custody hearing, Daniel's company was hosting its annual regional investor presentation, a public event, with press present, with financial disclosures required, with reputation on display. And Daniel was scheduled to give the keynote presentation on risk management and ethical leadership. The irony settled over me like cold steel, because suddenly, I saw the weakness in his entire structure. His legal strategy depended on two versions of himself, existing simultaneously. Private Daniel, quietly dismantling his family. Public Daniel, presenting himself as a model of integrity. And those two versions could not survive exposure at the same time. I looked at the calendar again, feeling something steady settle inside my chest. October 28th wasn't just a custody hearing date. It was a convergence point, and Daniel had absolutely no idea that I already knew exactly where I would be 3 hours after court ended. 2 days before the hearing, on a Sunday afternoon at exactly 3:28 p.m., I asked Daniel to help me load Lily into the car for what I told him was a quiet park visit before court week. He hesitated for 3 seconds before agreeing. 3 seconds. That was how long it took him to calculate whether the request posed a risk. He decided it didn't, because he still believed I was emotionally contained, predictable, harmless. The park we drove to wasn't random. It was 1 block from a small co-working office Vanessa had arranged for me to use privately. Daniel dropped us off near the entrance. "I'll pick you up at 5, he said casually. He didn't ask where exactly in the park we'd be. He didn't worry, because control had made him comfortable. The moment his car disappeared from view, Vanessa stepped out from behind a row of trees and approached calmly. Lily ran ahead toward the playground with a juice box. Vanessa crouched beside me. "Are you ready to see the full picture?" she asked. I nodded. Because the silent stage was over. Now we were in preparation. She handed me a folder thicker than any I had seen yet. Inside were certified copies of Daniel's LLC filings, property transfer drafts, and something even more critical, email correspondences subpoenaed through preliminary discovery motions. Daniel had been careless in one place, not legally, digitally. Because while he structured assets carefully, he communicated with Rebecca through a private but not fully secured server. Vanessa had obtained time-stamped exchanges discussing optimal custody leverage strategy. One email from Rebecca stood out. Subject line: Optics after injury. The content was brief. Position yourself as primary caregiver now. Courts preserve status quo. Documentation must precede filing. Documentation must precede filing. There it was. In writing. Not illegal, but revealing intent. Intent to create an image before seeking custody. Another email referenced Phase 3 activation aligned with Q4 relocation. Q4, fourth quarter, which meant Daniel had always planned to finalize separation before year-end, before tax filings, before bonus payouts. It was financial choreography. Vanessa pointed to a specific attachment. "This," she said quietly, "is where he miscalculated." It was a draft relocation agreement between Daniel and a property developer in Boise, Idaho. Boise, out of Oregon jurisdiction. The agreement was conditional upon anticipated custodial approval. Anticipated, not granted, which meant he had negotiated housing based on assumed victory. He hadn't just hoped to win custody. He had structured financial commitments around it. And that assumption was dangerous in court. Because judges do not like presumptive relocation planning before approval, especially when concealed, I felt a strange calm wash over me. Not excitement, not revenge. Just precision. Because now I understood the architecture completely. Tier 1, emotional narrative of instability. Tier 2, documentation through neuro report and school forms. Tier 3, relocation and asset shielding post-temporary order. Everything interlocked, except for one flaw. He had built it assuming silence from me. Vanessa leaned closer. "We can challenge temporary custody. We can expose relocation planning. But if you want maximum impact," she let the sentence trail off. I finished it quietly. "It can't just happen in court." She nodded. "Because while custody hearings determine legal status, reputational fractures happen elsewhere. And Daniel's public persona was not separate from his legal leverage. It reinforced it. Stable executive, ethical strategist, community mentor. That image supported his custody narrative, which meant dismantling one weakened the other. That evening, after Lily was asleep, I rolled into Daniel's office quietly. He was reviewing slides for his investor presentation. The screen read, "Integrity under pressure. Leadership in uncertain times." I almost admired the irony. He glanced at me briefly. "Nervous about Tuesday?" he asked. I answered honestly, "No." He studied me more carefully then, because something had shifted in my tone. "What changed?" he asked. I held his gaze steadily. "You assumed I'd fight emotionally." Silence stretched between us. "I'm fighting structurally," I continued. For the first time in months, I saw genuine uncertainty in his expression. "Don't make this uglier than it needs to be," he said quietly. There it was again. Ugly. As if exposure were uglier than orchestration. "You already accelerated it," I replied. He closed his laptop slowly. "You can't stop what's already in motion." That sentence might have intimidated me weeks ago. Now it clarified everything. Because Daniel believed momentum equaled inevitability. But momentum collapses when a foundational assumption fails. And his foundational assumption was my compliance. The next morning, I made 3 deliberate calls. First, to Lily's pediatric occupational therapist. I requested a formal statement documenting my adaptive caregiving training progress. Second, to my rehabilitation specialist. I requested updated functional capacity evaluation results, including independent parenting tasks I had mastered. Third, to Mrs. Carver. Yes, the the neighbor who had signed against me. I asked if she would be willing to meet privately. There was hesitation in her voice, but she agreed. That meeting lasted 47 minutes, and by the end of it, her expression had changed completely. Because when I calmly showed her the relocation draft to Boise and explained that Lily would be moved out of state immediately, something shifted. "You didn't know?" I asked gently. She shook her head slowly. "No. He never mentioned moving." Of course he hadn't, because revealing relocation too early risked social resistance. He had kept even his allies partially uninformed. Strategic compartmentalization. But compartmentalization becomes liability when exposed. As Mrs. Carver left my house that afternoon, she paused at the door. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said quietly. I believed her. Because most people don't realize they're participating in someone else's strategy until they see the full picture. That night, Daniel barely spoke at dinner. He sensed something. Control-driven people always do when variables shift. At 11:42 p.m., my phone vibrated. A message from Vanessa. Investor event confirmed open to community guests. Registration public. I stared at the screen for a long moment. October 28th, 9 a.m., custody hearing. 2 p.m., Daniel's keynote presentation. Public. Recorded. Press. Present. He believed the morning would secure his dominance. He had no idea the afternoon would test it. I rolled toward the window and looked out at the quiet Portland street. The night felt unusually still, and in that stillness, I understood something fully for the first time. Revenge isn't loud. It isn't explosive. It's alignment. Aligning truth with timing. Aligning evidence with exposure. Aligning narrative with consequence. Daniel built a strategy around silence. But silence ends when the right moment arrives. And October 28th wasn't just a hearing. It was a stage, and he had absolutely no idea that I had already secured a front row seat. The night before the hearing, at exactly 10:06 p.m., Daniel placed a single sheet of paper on my bedside table and said quietly, "If you sign this, tomorrow can stay simple." The paper, not officially. It was labeled Proposed Interim Parenting Agreement. I read the first line. Mother agrees to voluntary, temporary supervised visitation pending court review. Voluntary. That word carried a specific legal advantage. If I signed it, Daniel could present it in court as evidence that I had already acknowledged limited capacity. It would make his case nearly automatic. I looked up at him calmly. Why would I sign something that removes me from my daughter's life? He didn't flinch, because in his mind, this wasn't removal. It was optimization. You'd still see her, he said evenly, just without unnecessary stress. Unnecessary stress. That phrase told me everything about his internal logic. He wasn't trying to punish me. He was trying to eliminate variables. And in his equation, I had become a variable. I slid the paper back toward him without touching a pen. No. One word. Soft. Final. For the first time, I saw irritation flicker across his face. Not anger. Frustration. Because refusal disrupted efficiency. "This will get harder," he said quietly. "It already is," I replied. He held my gaze for a moment longer. Then he picked up the paper and left without another word. That exchange mattered more than it seemed, because it marked a shift in his perception. Until that moment, Daniel believed I would choose the least confrontational path. Now he knew I wouldn't. And control-driven people react unpredictably when their assumptions collapse. I didn't sleep that night, not from anxiety, from preparation. At midnight, Vanessa and I reviewed final strategy via video call. Her voice was calm and precise. "We are not trying to win full custody tomorrow," she said. "We are trying to prevent temporary relocation and preserve joint status." Preserve. That word mattered. Because custody battles aren't won in a single hearing. They're won by preventing irreversible shifts early. She outlined our 3 key points. First, my functional capacity improvements documented by medical professionals. Second, evidence of Daniel's pre-planned relocation negotiations. Third, procedural concern regarding his financial restructuring tied to custody assumptions. None of it was dramatic. All of it was strategic. Because courts respond to reason, not emotion. Then Vanessa said something that stayed with me. "The goal tomorrow isn't victory." She paused. "It's exposure." Exposure inside the legal framework first. Public exposure later. 2 stages, 2 arenas, 2 consequences. At 7:12 a.m., I dressed carefully for court. Not formal, not fragile. Neutral, controlled. Daniel wore his usual charcoal suit. Crisp, professional. He looked exactly like the image he intended to present. As we left the house, Lily stood by the door, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Are you both coming back?" she asked quietly. The question landed heavier than any legal argument. Because children sense instability long before adults acknowledge it, I smiled gently. "We're both coming back," I said, and I meant it in a way Daniel didn't understand yet. The courthouse smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. Our hearing began at 9:03 a.m. Daniel's attorney, Rebecca Whitmore, spoke first. Her voice was calm, authoritative. She framed the case exactly as expected. A devoted father, ensuring stability. A mother facing long-term physical limitations. Concern for the child's consistency. Then she presented the neuropsychological report, the school documentation, witness statements, each piece arranged like bricks in a wall. Not overwhelming individually, but collectively persuasive. When it was Vanessa's turn, she didn't attack emotionally. She dismantled structurally. She introduced updated medical evaluations, showing adaptive parenting capacity. She presented occupational therapy certifications. She established my independent caregiving routines. Then she shifted focus, calmly, deliberately. She introduced the relocation draft agreement. The courtroom air shifted immediately, because Daniel hadn't disclosed that document. Rebecca's composure tightened slightly. Vanessa continued. She explained the Boise housing contract tied to anticipated custodial approval. She highlighted timeline alignment with accelerated hearing requests. She didn't accuse. She simply laid out facts. And facts carry weight when presented without anger. Daniel's reaction was subtle, a tightening of his jaw, a stillness in his posture. Because for the first time, his strategy was visible as a coordinated plan, not isolated decisions. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Caldwell," she said calmly, "did you intend to relocate the minor child prior to final custody determination?" Daniel answered carefully, "Only if legally permitted." True. Technically, but incomplete. Vanessa didn't challenge the answer directly. Instead, she introduced one final element, the LLC trust documentation, naming Lily as asset beneficiary. She framed it neutrally, as evidence of financial planning tied to anticipated custodial outcomes. Again, not accusation. Context. And context changes interpretation. By 10:41 a.m., the judge delivered her temporary ruling. Joint legal custody maintained. No relocation permitted, pending full hearing. Primary residence status unchanged. The words felt quiet, not triumphant, but stabilizing. Daniel hadn't lost, but he hadn't secured what he needed most: momentum. As we left the courtroom, he walked beside me silently. Then he said something low enough that only I could hear. "You're making this more public than necessary." There it was, his real fear. Not losing custody immediately, losing narrative control. I met his gaze calmly. "You made it structural," I said. "I'm just making it visible." He didn't respond, because he understood something in that moment. The legal arena had shifted to neutral ground. But the next stage wasn't neutral. It was public. At 1:58 p.m., I rolled into the conference hall where Daniel's company was hosting its investor presentation. The room was filled with executives, stakeholders, and media personnel. Daniel stood near the stage, reviewing his slides, confident, composed, still believing the morning's outcome was manageable. He didn't see me at first, because I wasn't in the front row. I positioned myself 3 rows back, centered, within direct line of sight of the podium. Vanessa sat quietly beside me, not speaking, just waiting, because timing matters more than volume. At exactly 2:03 p.m., Daniel stepped onto the stage. The first slide appeared behind him. Integrity under pressure. He began speaking smoothly, controlled, persuasive. He looked exactly like the man he wanted the world to see, until his eyes scanned the audience and landed on me. At exactly 2:04 p.m., Daniel paused mid-sentence when his eyes locked onto mine in the 3rd row. The pause lasted less than 2 seconds. To everyone else in the room, It probably looked like a normal speaker's breath. But I knew Daniel's rhythms better than anyone. That pause wasn't part of his script. It was the first fracture in his control. He recovered quickly. Of course he did. Men like Daniel are trained to regain composure under pressure. He continued his presentation smoothly. Ethical leadership requires foresight, consistency, and accountability. The irony was almost surgical. Behind him, a slide displayed a clean graph labeled Risk Mitigation Through Transparency. Transparency. That word hung in the air like a quiet challenge. I sat still, hands folded, no expression. Because the most powerful disruption isn't loud. Its presence. Daniel's voice remained steady, but I could see small tells. His shoulders held slightly tighter than usual. His cadence was just a fraction faster. He moved into the Q&A portion at 2:31 p.m. A moderator walked down the aisle with a microphone. Investors asked predictable questions first. Quarterly projections. Market long-term asset strategies. Daniel answered each one with polished precision. Then, at 2:38 p.m., the moderator stopped 3 seats away from me. Next question, he said. I raised my hand calmly. The microphone reached me. Daniel's gaze snapped back to mine instantly, not surprised anymore. Alert. Calculate. Because now he understood. I wasn't there to watch. I was there to speak. My question is about leadership consistency, I said calmly. My voice carried clearly through the hall. No tremor. No emotion. Just when a leader emphasizes transparency and long-term stability, how should stakeholders interpret private financial restructuring that contradicts public commitments? The room shifted subtly, not dramatic, but attentive, because relevant. But it wasn't abstract. Daniel knew exactly what I was referring to. He answered carefully. Financial restructuring can be part of responsible planning, he said evenly, especially when protecting future beneficiaries. Future beneficiaries. He meant Lily. But he didn't say her name, because saying it would make the conversation personal, and personal was dangerous in a public forum. I nodded slightly, then asked the second question. Would stakeholders expect disclosure if that restructuring was tied to anticipated outcomes of unresolved legal proceedings? That sentence landed heavier, because now the implication was clear. Murmurs moved faintly through the audience. Not loud, but noticeable. Daniel's jaw tightened just slightly. He responded slowly. Legal matters are often confidential. Leaders must balance privacy with transparency. A technically correct answer, but incomplete. And incomplete answers create curiosity. That's when I delivered the final line. Not loudly, not aggressively, just clearly. So if a leader publicly promotes ethical risk management while privately structuring assets around anticipated custody outcomes before a court decision, would that reflect transparency or preemptive manipulation? Silence fell instantly. Not hostile silence. Focused silence. The kind that sharpens attention. Because now the context was unmistakable. Daniel didn't answer immediately. For the first time, his control faltered visibly. Not dramatically, just enough. His breathing slowed. His eyes flicked briefly toward the moderator, then back to me. He said carefully, "Personal legal matters are not appropriate for public discussion." That was his pivot. Containment. But the question had already done its work, because perception doesn't require full answers. It requires credible doubt. The moderator stepped in quickly, redirecting to another attendee. The presentation continued. But the room's energy had changed. Subtly, irreversibly. Because once credibility cracks publicly, even slightly, it doesn't reseal easily. I handed the microphone back and sat quietly. Vanessa leaned toward me and whispered, "Perfect." Not because it humiliated him, because it achieved the goal. Alignment. The public image of absolute integrity now carried a visible question mark. And that mattered more than any dramatic confrontation. The session ended at 3:07 p.m. As attendees mingled, Daniel approached me slowly. His face was calm, but his eyes carried something new. Not anger, not fear. Recognition. "You crossed a line," he said quietly. I met his gaze steadily. "No," I replied. "I drew one. A line between private strategy and public identity. Between narrative control and exposed context." Between power and accountability, he exhaled slowly. You're trying to destroy my reputation. There it was. The victim stage. Predictable. Structured. Part of the collapse sequence. I shook my head gently. I'm aligning it with your actions. That sentence landed deeper than accusation, because it removed emotion entirely. Just cause and effect. He didn't respond immediately, because there was no efficient counter-argument to alignment. Then he said something that revealed the last layer of his mindset. You're risking Lily's stability by escalating this. There it was. The final refuge. Positioning himself as protector. Me as disruptor, I answered calmly. Lily's stability isn't threatened by truth. A long silence stretched between us. And in that silence, something shifted. For the first time since the accident, Daniel no longer held narrative dominance, because his identity relied on coherence, and coherence had fractured. That evening, Vanessa called with updates. 2 investors had requested clarification from Daniel's company regarding potential undisclosed personal legal risks. Not accusations, questions. But questions trigger internal reviews, and internal reviews create pressure. Daniel's professional world was now intersecting with his personal strategy, exactly where he never wanted them to meet. But the most important consequence wasn't public. It was psychological, because Daniel had entered the final stage of opposition behavior. From that moment forward, he would move through a predictable sequence. First, denial. Then, blame shifting. Then, victim positioning. Finally, collapse. I rolled toward the window that night and watched the quiet street outside. For months, Daniel had believed this conflict was about logistics, mobility, finances, practicality. But it had never been about those things. It had been about power. And power changes hands not when someone shouts, but when someone stops fearing exposure. I looked down at my phone as a new message appeared from Vanessa. It contained a single line. We just received discovery approval for full financial records, including communications related to Phase 3 planning. Full financial records, which meant something Daniel had relied on for years, was about to become visible. Because buried inside those communications it revealed intent. An intent would trigger consequences far beyond custody. 5 days after the investor presentation, at exactly 8:11 a.m., Daniel received a certified letter at the front door while Lily and I were eating breakfast. He signed for it without looking at the sender. But the moment he saw the return address, his posture changed. Not dramatically, just a subtle stillness. The kind that only happens when someone realizes a controlled system has shifted beyond their reach. The letter was from his company's internal compliance division. Subject line visible through the envelope window. Request for disclosure clarification. He didn't open it immediately. He placed it on the kitchen counter beside his coffee and continued stirring slowly, as if delaying the inevitable by a few seconds would change the contents. Lily noticed nothing. She was focused on cutting her pancakes into perfect squares, something she'd started doing since Daniel began emphasizing neatness at meals. I watched him quietly, because the collapse phase doesn't begin with shouting. It begins with silence. After Lily left for school, he finally opened the letter. His eyes moved quickly across the page, then slower, then stopped. A long exhale escaped him. That was the first visible crack, because control-driven people breathe differently when they realize they can no longer contain outcomes. He looked up at me. You contacted them, he said flatly. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation framed as certainty. I shook my head calmly. No. And it was true. I hadn't contacted anyone at his company. I didn't need to. Public doubt had done the work naturally. Questions trigger review processes automatically in corporate governance systems. He knew that. Which meant he also knew something worse. His professional reputation was now under formal scrutiny, not because of lies, because of alignment between his personal actions and his public leadership claims. That's when he entered the second stage, blame. You've escalated this beyond what was necessary, he said quietly. His tone wasn't angry, it was defensive, because his identity wasn't just being challenged legally anymore. It was being evaluated institutionally. I asked questions. I replied. Your actions created the answers. That sentence landed with finality, because it removed conflict entirely. Just cause and consequence. He turned away and gripped the edge of the counter. For the first time in years, I saw uncertainty in his posture. Not emotional vulnerability, structural instability. He had spent years controlling variables. Now variables were multiplying beyond his management capacity. That afternoon, Vanessa called with the full discovery report. Her voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable weight. "We have it," she said. "What?" I asked quietly. "The intent documentation." She paused before explaining. Inside Daniel's email archive, within communications with Rebecca, there was a specific exchange from 14 months earlier, 6 months before the accident. Subject line: long-term exit strategy. The email wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was written in Daniel's typical analytical tone. But the content changed everything. He wrote, "If a triggering life event occurs that significantly alters spousal functional independence, I will need to activate contingency asset separation and custodial positioning immediately." Triggering life event. Functional independence. Contingency separation. Every phrase was clinical, detached, strategic, and devastating because it proved something critical. He hadn't just prepared for divorce in general. He had specifically planned for separation under conditions of spousal vulnerability, which meant the accident hadn't created his plan. It had activated it. Vanessa continued explaining quietly. "This doesn't prove wrongdoing," she said, "but it establishes intent, that his strategy was pre-constructed around potential incapacity scenarios." Intent. The final layer. Tier 3. Because courts evaluate not just actions, but motivations behind them. And motivations tied to opportunistic exploitation of vulnerability carry enormous weight. I sat there absorbing the reality slowly, not shocked, not angry, just clear. Because the truth had now reached its full form. Daniel hadn't abandoned me because I became disabled. He had prepared for the possibility long before it happened, which meant our marriage hadn't ended due to crisis. It had ended because he had always treated it as a conditional contract. That evening, Daniel came home later than usual. He didn't greet me. He didn't mention the compliance letter. He walked directly into his office and closed the door. At 9:42 p.m., he emerged, holding a single folder. He placed it on the table between us. Inside was a voluntary settlement proposal. Joint custody, no relocation. Full asset transparency. Mutual non-disclosure agreement. It was generous. Fair. Everything I had been fighting to secure. He spoke quietly. "We can end this without further damage." There it was. The final stage. Collapse. Not emotional collapse. Strategic surrender. Because his system of control had reached a point where continued conflict carried greater risk than compromise. I looked at him steadily. "You're not offering this because you want fairness," I said. "You're offering it because you can't control the outcome anymore." He didn't deny it, because denial requires belief, and belief had already fractured. He sat down slowly. For the first time since the accident, he looked tired. Not physically, psychologically, because maintaining total control over every variable for years carries enormous internal strain. And when that control breaks, exhaustion follows. "I didn't plan to hurt you," he said quietly. That was the closest he had ever come to an apology. But it wasn't one. It was justification. "I planned to protect stability," he continued. There it was again. His core belief. Stability above relationship. Efficiency above empathy. I answered calmly. "You planned to protect yourself." A long silence filled the room. He didn't argue, because somewhere deep inside, he knew it was true. That night, I lay awake, thinking about everything that had happened. The accident, the planning, the legal battle, the exposure. And I realized something important. This had never been a story about revenge. It was a story about boundaries, about refusing to let someone redefine your worth through their fear of losing control. The next morning, Vanessa called one final time. "The full custody hearing date is set," she said. I listened quietly as she continued. December 12th, 6 weeks away. Enough time for final negotiations. Enough time for legal consequences to fully unfold. But she added one more detail that made my breath still. Daniel's company has initiated a formal ethics review regarding undisclosed personal conflicts affecting leadership integrity. Formal review, which meant something irreversible. because even if he retained his position, his reputation would never fully recover. The system he had relied on for identity and power had now turned its scrutiny toward him. And scrutiny is something control-driven people fear more than loss itself. I rolled toward the window and watched the quiet winter rain falling outside. For the first time in nearly 2 years, I felt something unfamiliar. Not relief, not victory, peace, because the truth had fully surfaced. And when truth is complete, there is nothing left to fight. But there was still one final stage left. Not legal, not reputational, personal. Because December 12th wouldn't just determine custody, it would determine something far more important. What kind of life Lily would grow up watching her parents choose to build after the war ended. On the morning of December 12th, at exactly 8:02 a.m., I watched Lily tie her shoes by herself for the first time without asking for help. It took her 47 seconds. She frowned in concentration the entire time. Then she looked up at me with quiet pride and said, "I did it alone." That moment mattered more than any court ruling that would follow later that day. Because independence, real independence, isn't about abandoning support. It's about learning to stand steady, even when life changes shape around you. And that was the lesson this entire year had forced me to learn. The courthouse felt different that morning. Not tense, not heavy, just calm. Because the war phase had already ended weeks earlier. What remained now was resolution. Daniel arrived early. He wore a simple navy suit instead of his usual sharp charcoal. His posture was straight, but no longer rigid. Control hadn't disappeared from him, but something inside had softened. Not emotionally, practically. The formal ethics review at his company had concluded 2 weeks earlier. He hadn't been fired, but he had been removed from leadership presentations and reassigned to a non-client-facing role. No public announcement, no scandal, just quiet demotion. The kind that permanently alters how someone sees themselves. His identity as a flawless strategist had cracked. And once identity cracks, people change. Inside the courtroom, the final hearing lasted less than 2 hours. There were no dramatic confrontations, no emotional testimonies, because the evidence had already done its work. The judge reviewed the settlement agreement Daniel had offered weeks earlier. Joint legal and physical custody, no relocation without mutual consent, equal parenting schedule, adapted for accessibility, full financial transparency with Lily's trust, restructured under neutral third-party oversight. Every term reflected balance. Not victory for either side, just fairness. At 10:17 a.m., the judge signed the final order. And just like that, the war officially ended. No applause, no emotional release, just quiet finality. As we exited the courtroom, Daniel and I stood in the hallway for a moment without speaking. Then he said something that surprised me. "I underestimated you." There was no defensiveness in his voice, no bitterness, just acknowledgement. I nodded slowly. "You underestimated yourself too," I replied. He looked at me, confused. "You thought control was the same as strength," I said calmly. "It isn't." That sentence hung between us quietly, because it wasn't an accusation, it was truth. And truth doesn't require reaction. We walked outside together. Lily waited near the entrance with her backpack, swinging it gently back and forth. She looked between us nervously, then asked the question that had hovered unspoken for months. Are we still a family? Children don't ask legal questions. They ask emotional ones. I rolled closer to her and smiled softly. Yes, I said. We're just a different kind of family now. Daniel knelt beside her. For the first time in nearly a year, his voice carried something new. Not calculation, not strategy, just sincerity. You'll always have both of us, he said quietly. And for the first time, I believed him. Because control-driven people don't change through confrontation. They change through consequence, through losing the illusion that they can manage every outcome, through learning that relationships aren't variables to optimize, they're realities to respect. 6 months later, life had settled into something unexpectedly peaceful. Lily spent equal time in both homes. Daniel moved into a townhouse closer to her school, fully accessible. Not because the court required it, because he chose to. He never explained why. He didn't need to. Some changes don't come with apologies. They come with actions. I returned to work part-time at the veterinary clinic. Different responsibilities now. More administrative, less surgical, but still meaningful, still mine. Every Wednesday evening, Lily and I sat on the back patio, watching the sunset together. It became our quiet ritual. One evening in early summer, she asked me something while drawing with chalk on the concrete. "Mom, were you mad at Daddy?" Children sense emotional history, even when adults don't speak about it. I thought carefully before answering. "I was hurt," I said gently. "But hurt doesn't last forever if you learn from it." She nodded slowly, accepting the simplicity. Then she asked another question. "Did you win?" I smiled softly, because that question carried the same misunderstanding most adults have about conflict. "This wasn't about winning," I said. "It was about not losing myself." She seemed satisfied with that answer. And in that moment, I realized something deeply important. Revenge isn't what most people think it is. It isn't punishment. It isn't destruction. Real revenge is living calmly after someone tries to define your worth. It's setting boundaries so clear that no one can rewrite your identity again. It's building peace so stable that control no longer has power over you. 1 year after the final hearing, on a quiet autumn afternoon, I rolled into the same park where Vanessa had first handed me the evidence folder. The leaves were turning gold. Children's laughter drifted softly across the air. I sat there for a long time, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. No anger, no regret, just stillness. Because the truth had done its work. And when truth finishes its work, there is nothing left to fight, only space to heal. If you've made it this far in the story, take a moment right now to like this video in the comments. Tell me honestly, have you ever had to rebuild your life after someone quietly tried to erase you? And if this story resonated with you, you might want to listen to the next one. Because sometimes the deepest betrayals don't come from people who leave. They come from people who stay and slowly rewrite your reality until you no longer recognize yourself.